Psychology, welcome to your Unit 3 test review. I will go over each of these items. I'm going over the topics. I'm going to be specific enough to help you, but I'll move quickly. You can use the pause button. You can rewind this, go back a few seconds and get what you need. Okay, you need to know that the portion of memory that is more or less permanent is long-term memory. Learning to make a reflex response to a stimulus other than to the original natural stimulus is called classical conditioning. You need to know that stimulus discrimination is an operant conditioning procedure in which successive approximations of a desired response are reinforced. If an 11-year-old can answer questions like most 15-year-olds, you need to know what this person's mental age would be. What would their mental age be? Approximately what percentage of IQ scores fall between 70 and 130? You need to know that it is in your archive lectures. You need to know that it is easier to recall items at the beginning and end of a list of unrelated items. This is the serial position effect. 10-year-old with a mental age of 10 would have an IQ of 100. You need to know whether this would be average, above average, or below average. An example of a test using recognition is a multiple choice test. The Roman Catholic priest Bernard Pagano was falsely identified by 7 eyewitnesses and found guilty of armed robbery. This is the instance of a false positive. The abbreviation unconditioned response is UCR. The abbreviation for unconditional response is UCR. In operant conditioning, reinforcement is necessary to create the association between a stimulus and the repetition of a voluntary response. The conditioned stimulus in the case of little Albert was a white rat. The unconditioned stimulus in the case of little Albert was a loud noise. A gold star is a secondary reinforcer. Learning that occurs but is not immediately reflected in behavioral change is known by psychologists as latent learning. If one wants to increase the capacity of short-term memory, more items can be held through the process of chunking. The abbreviation of CS stands for conditioned stimulus. If a young man is mildly developmentally delayed, his mother drank heavily while pregnant with him, this person most likely suffers from fetal alcohol syndrome. If someone becomes sick after eating chili dogs, this person no longer likes chili dogs. They have experienced a conditioned taste aversion. The researcher responsible for discovering classical conditioning was Ivan Pavlov. When a test allows a person from a particular cultural background to have an unfair advantage over persons from other backgrounds, this is cultural bias. This is cultural bias. An 8-year-old child who scores like a 10-year-old has an IQ of 125. The abbreviation UCS stands for unconditioned stimulus. Learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. Conditioned response. A conditioned response occurred when Pavlov placed meat powder in the mouth of dogs and then they began to salivate. The food acted as an unconditioned response. Food acted as an unconditioned response. The conditioned response occurred when dogs salivated at the sound of a bell. The conditioned response occurred when his dogs salivated at the sound of the bell. School issues tokens to children for good behavior. Issuing tokens is an example of behavioral modification. Behavioral modification. Ike and Metcalf found if you were really happy when learning math, you should be happy when taking the math exam to best recall. You should be happy when taking the math exam to best recall. The first step in the memory process is encoding information in a form that the memory system can use. Learning phobias is a good example of conditioned emotional response. The learning of phobias is a good example of conditioned emotional response. Mental categories representing activities, objectives, qualities, or situations represents concepts. Thorndike's law of effect says, if a response is followed by a pleasurable consequence, it will likely be repeated. If a response is followed by an unpleasant consequence, it will likely not be repeated. The tendency to respond to a stimulus that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus is called response generalization. Chunking is a means of combining information into meaningful units. The best place to take your biology exam to ensure good retrieval of biology concepts is the biology classroom. What percent of the population has an intelligence quotient below 100? That is 50%. 50% of the population has an intelligence quotient below 100. Researcher Walter Seligman placed dogs in a cage with metal bars on the floor to illustrate learned helplessness. When the CS is repeatedly presented in the absence of the UCS, the CR will die out in a process called extinction. Information gets from the sensory memory to the short-term memory through the process of selective attention. A box used in operant conditioning of animals that limits the available responses and thus increases the likelihood that the desired response will occur is called the Skinner box. When given a list of items to remember, people tend to do better at recalling the first item on the list rather than items at the middle of the list. This is known as the primacy effect. A cupcake is an example of a primary reinforcer, whereas a gold star is an example of a secondary reinforcer. A car is most likely the prototype for the concept vehicle. Normally, when food is placed in the mouth of any animal, the salivary glands start releasing saliva to help with chewing and digestion. In terms of Pavlov's analysis of learning, salivation would be referred to as an unconditioned response. When there is a decrease in the likelihood or rate of a target response, punishment has occurred. A negative reinforcer is a stimulus that is removed and thus increases the probability of a response. Miller found the magic number 7 to be the capacity of short-term memory. In your college dorm, anytime you take a shower, someone always flushes the toilet and causes the water in your shower to turn icy cold, making you cringe. After several episodes like this, you find that you tend to cringe whenever you a toilet flush. No matter where you are showering, in this example, you need to know the conditioned stimulus. Okay, what is the conditioned stimulus? You need to know that the multiple use test is an example of divergent thinking. Okay, there you go. I hope you find this useful. Feel free to pause this recording, rewind the recording, take notes on this to help you study, make flashcards, and wish you the best. Take care.